So the first episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds' fourth season dropped a few days ago. And now that we know that this show and Starfleet Academy are both ending, and this whole period of Star Trek history, characterized by Alex Kurtzman's influence over the franchise, is essentially coming to an end, it's a reasonable question to ask, is it actually worth putting the time into discussing these episodes anymore? Since whatever comes next, the movie that's currently in development, for example, is going to be something completely different. But I think it is still worth talking about these episodes because by identifying the good and the bad things about them, we can get closer to the essence of what Star Trek should be and what these future productions need to do differently. Now, the first thing I want to say, and spoilers ahead if you haven't seen the episode yet, the premise of this episode is really cool. This is exactly the kind of premise that I wanted Star Trek to do more in the past. Even in the era of Star Trek that I love the most, the Next Generation through to Enterprise era, there weren't anywhere near enough stories that took advantage of what the Star Trek universe is capable of exploring. And the idea of going back and looking at the solar system millions of years ago is fascinating. I've always wondered what intelligent civilizations were around before the Vulcans, before the ones that we know and love today. This episode really gets into that, and I really appreciate that. Not only is the time travel aspect of the story going back to this period of Earth's history fascinating, I also love the idea of there being civilizations in the solar system before ours. This ancient Martian civilization, and then the existence of a fifth planet in the solar system and a civilization there too. That stuff is amazing, and I absolutely love it. Another awesome element of this episode I do want to draw attention to is the fact that the Martian civilization is so different from ours. I love the subtleties of that, not just that it's a warlike race that has never encountered the idea of having a friendly relationship with an alien race before, but also the subtleties, the fact that they have a different concept of loneliness, that their translator interprets Pike's use of alone to mean widowed, that it can pick up on that kind of subtlety of meaning. So the premise and that aspect of the story I absolutely love, and I think is very much in the tradition of Star Trek. Where I think this episode really went wrong though, and resulted in it not fulfilling that premise anywhere near as well as it could have done, is in the writing. And there's several aspects of that I want to talk about. The two biggest issues in this episode for me were plot convenience and how characters behave. Firstly, on the plot convenience point, so I find it really hard to believe that the Enterprise was exploring a random star system and happened to find a quantum pairing that took it directly to Earth's solar system at exactly the point that the dinosaurs were about to go extinct. It's difficult for us to conceptualize both just how huge a span of time a million years is and just how huge space is. So for this quantum tunneling to go directly to Earth, which was, by the way, in a completely different part of space to where it is now, 65 million years ago, and to arrive within a few days of the extinction of the dinosaurs just seems completely unbelievable to me. And the other element of plot convenience that I found really frustrating was that Spock establishes that the only way to do this kind of time traveling is to have the energy of a supernova available. And then towards the end of the episode, the combined effect of the antimatter bomb that the Martians use on the fifth planet and the destruction of that planet provides exactly the energy they need to do the same journey in reverse. Yet surely that's nowhere near as much energy as a supernova explosion. If that was the energy of a supernova explosion, it would destroy the entire solar system. And also presumably the size and type of the explosion is going to affect how far you travel through time anyway. So it's not clear to me at all how they managed to bring themselves back to the same point they left from. And then the other really big issue for me with this episode, and perhaps more important, is the way the characters behave. The worst case of this is towards the end when the Martian ship is going up towards the fifth planet. It was probably obvious to almost any viewer within a second or so of that ship heading towards that planet that what the fifth planet actually was the future asteroid belt. It takes you about half a second more to think, well, if we stop that planet from getting destroyed, we're going to stop the formation of the asteroid belt and completely change the history of the solar system. Apparently Pike doesn't have this realization for like 30 or 40 seconds, and number one takes even longer than that. It was really frustrating watching the two of them just acting like they don't have any idea what's happening when anyone with the most basic knowledge of the solar system has already figured it out. And then I definitely sympathize with number one not wanting to be complicit in the destruction of a planet, but at the same time, earlier in the episode we were really worried that killing one dinosaur might fundamentally alter the future, but that concern apparently just disappears when fundamentally altering the structure of the entire solar system is what's in consideration instead. At the end of the episode, they're all reflecting on their role in the complete destruction of essentially two civilizations, and I found myself thinking, everybody here is going to need therapy after this experience. They shouldn't just be able to carry on with life after going through this insane story. And that's a small issue with the episodic structure of Strange New Worlds. Sometimes the stories don't have enough impact on the ones that follow. One other point I wanted to make about characterization concerns the character of Pelia. She's funny some of the time, and I do enjoy her at times, But I think Pike really needs to sit down and have a conversation with her about the amount of time she takes up cracking jokes, rambling on, and stating the blindingly obvious in the middle of crisis situations or important meetings. It completely breaks the fourth wall for me when you're in this serious meeting about serious topics, and there's a character just acting like a complete buffoon and everyone's taking it in their stride. I like the fact that Pike runs a ship where a bit of camaraderie and a bit of fun is acceptable, but there are reasonable and believable limits to that. And we saw the same issue on Starfleet Academy, by the way. This is a common issue in Kurtzman Trek, that people don't act with the appropriate seriousness for the situation they're in. Now, aside from those two big issues, some of the other issues I have are to do with logical and scientific consistency, recurring tropes in the Kurtzman era Star Trek, and the ways in which this episode and others like it try to reference old Star Trek but often get it wrong. So starting with logical and scientific issues, there are a number of things in this episode that just didn't make sense to me scientifically. For instance, when they arrive in this solar system, it's not clear to me how they identified it as being this solar system. As I mentioned earlier, the entire solar system will be in a different location 65 million years ago. The galaxy rotates, stars will move relative to each other, so the surrounding stellar environment will be completely different. Not only that, the sun's physical characteristics will be different. Stars evolve over their lifetimes, and 65 million years is more than enough time for a star's mass and composition to change significantly. And as we see in this episode, the entire structure of the solar system is different. The planets are closer to the sun than they are today because of the existence of the fifth planet. And the planets themselves are also physically substantially different from how they are today. Now, at the end of the episode, when the fifth planet is destroyed, we see that a fragment of it heads towards the inner solar system and becomes the asteroid that destroys the dinosaur. Now, not only did I think that was a really lame and unnecessary contrivance to throw in at the end of your episode, but also that would take months for that asteroid to get to the inner solar system. That's just not how the dynamics of spaceflight works. If the debris from this explosion hit Earth at enough velocity to have got there in a matter of minutes, it would just completely annihilate the planet. It bothers me a bit that time travel happens quite frequently in the Star Trek universe, and every time it happens, we're worried about stepping on things in the past and changing the future. But if this can happen so easily and so often, isn't that happening all the time? Like, aren't people going back to the dinosaur era and killing dinosaurs and changing the future like every day? How would we even know if that was happening? Perhaps that's actually an explanation for some of the differences between the Star Trek universe and different iterations. Somebody went back and changed the past and we never even knew about it. And then one other little thing that bothered me in this episode was the fact that the Martians look so human. I get the production reasons historically why Star Trek aliens look so human, and I like the explanation in The Next Generation that all of these races were essentially designed by a common ancestor. But for a race that existed 65 billion years ago and evolved on a planet with significantly less gravity than Earth, to have basically a Vulcan appearance really bothered me. They should have been a lot taller and a lot more alien looking. And then this episode also exhibited a number of tropes of Kurtzman era Star Trek that I would like to see the franchise move on from in the future. One of these is what I call video game planets, or I also call them sunset planets or haze planets. A lot of the planets that we go to in the Kurtzman era Star Trek shows have this like eternal sunset effect going on. Everything is hazy, moody colors, and it all looks a bit soft and squishy. It looks like the actors are just standing in a video game environment a lot of the time. In fact, this is a general issue with the visual effects that goes all the way back to the beginning of Discovery. And people pointed this out way back in 2017 and they just never addressed it. I don't know if it's budget, I don't know if it's style, but there's something about the effects in these Star Trek shows that just doesn't look convincing. It looks cartoonish and it looks like a video game. If you compare it to the Orville, which was contemporary with Star Trek Discovery, whether they're using models or CGI, the ships and the space scenes and the environments in the Orville look completely convincing. They feel like you could touch them. And a lot of the time that's true even in the earlier Star Trek shows, even in Voyager and the earlier part of Enterprise before the budget on Enterprise really got cut. Things are pretty convincing, things look pretty believable even today. But something about the visual effects in these Kurtzman era shows just looks fake and smudgy to me. And I don't like the fact that these environments just don't look believable. They don't look like real planets. And I particularly noticed that in this one where it's supposed to be Earth, but what we see are these extreme canyon environments and an intensely overpopulated ecosystem with dinosaurs every 10 feet, all interacting in this kind of Jurassic Park style. It's also a frustrating tendency of this era of Star Trek for me to go toward monsters as the enemy. There's a lot of dinosaur type creatures that turn up in these shows, as well as zombies and other things like that. It feels like the writers are going in this direction of just creating simple monster of the week enemies rather than coming up with complex, interesting morality stories like Star Trek traditionally does. And that's a really big thing I'd like to see future Star Trek get right, is get back towards the intellectual storytelling. And then one last trope I'd like to talk about is the fact that this episode and a lot like it tend to be self-referential. They repeat stories, repeat elements from previous Star Trek shows. Two quick examples in this one, both relating to Enterprise. The interaction Uhura has with the new Vulcan crew member at the start and the end of the episode is very similar to T'Pol in early Enterprise, especially the interaction about not speaking Vulcan on the bridge. That is exactly the same interaction that Hoshi and T'Pol have on the first episode of Enterprise. Likewise, the idea that Valis Marianis is a giant scar inflicted on the planet as part of a war is very similar to what the Xindi do at the end of season 2 of Enterprise. Now, I'm fine with Star Trek reusing some of its ideas from time to time and also paying tribute to itself, but it needs to do it in an intelligent and creative way. And a lot of the time, it feels like the newer shows are just imitating the older ones, but don't really understand what makes them tick. And I notice this especially with the Vulcans in these shows. The Vulcans seem like stereotypes of themselves. They seem like they're going through the motions of acting and behaving like a Vulcan, being stuck up, being overly logical, not understanding humor, but the nuance is missing, the subtlety is missing. They don't seem like real characters operating on a real philosophy. They seem like people doing impressions of Vulcans. But despite these negative points I'm picking up on, I do think this episode had a lot of potential. And I find it really encouraging that they're trying to explore scientific concepts, trying to open viewers' minds by proposing interesting ideas about the history of the solar system. I just think it needs to be done a lot more intelligently and a lot more respectfully of the intelligence of fans.